want to say a special thank you to everyone at Self Esteem Brands. We are grateful for the recording space and support you have provided to our podcast platform and team. You can find more information about Self Esteem Brands in the show notes. We appreciate and savor every sip of Dry Farm wines during our podcast conversations and every event at the Point Retreats. To find out more about Dry Farm wines, find their link in our show notes. Thank you, Paddle North, for being our preferred Minnesota-based brand and company. We honor every memorable paddle. To find out more information about Paddle North, find their link in our show notes. The Point Retreats and Rentals is situated roughly 30 minutes outside Brainerd, Minnesota. The property's private peninsula boasts over 1,500 feet of stunning shoreline spanning 3 lakes on the pristine Whitefish chain of lakes. Whether you need time to renew, reset, or reconnect, we have a space that can host your family, group, or team. Click on the show notes to find out more about the Point Retreats and the Point Rentals. Welcome everyone to the Rebel and Be Well show. I am Christa Rymal and I am the podcast host of the Rebel and Be Well podcast show, along with the founder and co-owner of the Point Retreats and Rentals. And I just want to thank all of you that are here with us today, joining us for this really special event with Chef Sean Sherman. And I also want to acknowledge the people that are watching us online and say thank you for joining us online. A couple of special thank yous to say. Jessica Schneider, who's in the back, she's with Self Esteem Brands. I want to say thank you to you for helping us coordinate this event. Thank you to Self Esteem Brands for allowing us to use your space to record this podcast along with all of our Season 3 podcasts. And I also want to say thank you to Nick Zahaski for all of the delicious Indigenous influenced appetizers. Those were really amazing and will continue to be enjoyed. Thank you to Dry Farm Wines for providing the wine that we all are enjoying this afternoon. And also a thank you to Marshall, who is our podcast manager with Minnesota Podcasting. And very importantly, a big welcome and thank you to Sean Sherman for being here with us today. I really appreciate you being here. I know your demands are high and asks are many, so thank you for being with us today. And I'll tell you, Sean, when I prepare for a podcast, I usually a day or two ahead of time start to do some research on the individual that I'm podcasting with and listen to maybe previous podcasts, other YouTube shows, look at different articles that I can find. And I thought I had everything all set last night. Like I had all my questions laid out. I picked, I went from 200 down to 10. And I was really excited that I felt really well prepared. And then I woke up this morning to a couple of texts from friends and were like, well, are you really nervous now? And I'm like, now? I was kind of nervous last night. What does now mean? And then I was like, well, I better investigate this a little bit. And so I decided to look on your social media pages. And I quickly understood what the now meant. So I don't know if everybody here in the audience understands what Sean was awarded with this morning, but he was named one of Time's 100 most influential people in 2023 around the world. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Worth a huge, huge applause because I have no doubt as we go through our conversation, those that don't know you or want to know you better are going to understand why you are one of these 100 people. I'm just going to put up a couple other slides here. This was Sean actually in the kitchen cooking. I think this was a New York Times photo from an article that you were in. And I think we're having a harder time finding magazines and publications you haven't been in than you have at this point, which is pretty impressive. But I have to tell you, I showed my youngest daughter this, and she's 15, and she's like, Mom, that's really cool to be like Joe Biden and Little Nas. And I'm like, yeah, that's super cool. Not very many people can be like the president and one of the best rappers. So, you've arrived is kind of what I would say, right? So it's pretty impressive. So for those of you that don't know Sean as well, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Sean here, a couple of highlights of his life that he has graciously shared with us and his team has. So Sean was born and raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He's a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe. He's cooked in kitchens across the U.S. and Mexico for over 30 years. In 2014, Chef Sean opened the business, The Sous Chef, which provided catering and food education in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. A couple years later, in 2018, Sean's first book, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, received the James Beard Award for the Best American Cookbook. In July of 2021, Chef Sean and his partner opened up Owamni Restaurant, Minnesota's first full-service Indigenous restaurant featuring healthy Indigenous food and drinks. And in 2022, Owamni was named one of New York Times' top 50 restaurants. I know, it was super impressive, yeah. So in addition to all of these great accomplishments, Sean, today I hope we can learn other things about you and from you, like your philosophy around food as medicine, maybe even like your favorite hobby and health habits. Where do you go to escape all of this at times to recoup and recover yourself? And I have to ask you at some point in here, your concept around why lawns are stupid. Like, I love that. And there's a really good answer for that. So I want to ask you that question too.
Sure.
But to complete our introduction of you here, I want to share some words that you shared this morning in one of your posts, written by Padma Lakshmi, host of Bravo Top Chef. She said, through Sean's work, which is truly about so much more than food, he brings a deep sense of pride and identity to the Indigenous community, the importance of which cannot be overstated. Sean has inspired many people to become curious about Native communities, the beauty of their dishes, and the importance of eating harmoniously with Mother Nature. I thought that was such a beautiful description of you, and the little bit that I know of you, it just fit you so well and was so beautifully poised and said. So I wanted to end your introduction with those words. And it's a true honor to have you here, so I want to say thank you. Sean, when he walked in, I kind of looked at him and I was like, so how's your day going? Like, what happens when you're named like one of the top 100 most influential people in the world? And, I think it's been a little busy. So I appreciate that Sean is still here and spending time with all of us today, because you have so much that has captivated me, and I'm really excited to share and inspire others here today with us. So I also want to mention, Sean and I kind of have a unique connection in how we met one another, which went back to 2017. I actually was at a retreat of my own and met a woman named Hilda, and I was sharing with her a little bit about the Point Retreats. And the Point Retreats is actually on a piece of property that has 6 excavated Native American burial mounds. And I was expressing to Hilda that I would love to continue to learn more about the Indigenous and Native history on our property. And she said, well, have you met Sean Sherman? And I said, no, I haven't met Sean. And she told me a little bit about you. I was like, well, no, I really need to connect with Sean. And she shared your email. And I emailed you, and in the kind exchange back, you said, oh, interesting that you're in Pequot Lakes. Do you know Larry and Gail Schultz? And I was like, there is no way that he knows Larry and Gail Schultz, because I'm in California on this retreat and talking about, this little tiny piece of property in northern Minnesota. And lo and behold, Sean and I both have a mutual respect and admiration for a great friend up north that Sean knew for many years and was a great friend of the family. And lo and behold, Larry is the gentleman who built all of the cabins on the Point Retreats property. So right away, we had kind of a similar path that crossed in our stories, and just kind of created this immediate connection and appreciation. So excited that you are now here, and I get to dig in a little bit deeper into everything that's happened to you since 2017, which is like
a lot.
Been a lot. Yeah, I literally had 200 questions. It was tough to cut them down to 10. So how we'll kind of structure this here is I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask Sean initially, and then I am going to open it up to the audience to ask their questions. We had a few that were submitted, but I would really love it if the audience would be willing to come up and just interact with Sean yourself, and there's a mic here for you when we get to that point. So keep in mind, add your questions, write them down, and you'll have time to ask Sean and interact with him in that capacity. So, okay, so I'm taking a little leap of faith.
Okay.
And I don't know if any other podcast guest has shown this photo of you.
It's funny.
And I knew they were going to do that. I figured they'd do that because that's what I did. So is that not like the best photo ever? I saw that photo and I was like, oh, Sean might kill me. Should I ask him for permission or ask for forgiveness? I'm asking for forgiveness.
It's all good.
But I love this photo of Sean. And there's a few reasons, because it to me represents like this young adult, right? That at that time you probably wouldn't have even conceived all that you have experienced and done and been through. But you have this like really confident look about you, slightly rebellious maybe, which fits Rebellion
Pretty
Be Well
rebellious
podcast.
back then, yeah.
Was it? Okay,
Oh,
I
yeah.
kind of wondered, but I don't want to like fully call you out. But you can choose to share those stories or not. But I'm wondering if we can start with you just kind of telling us a little bit about this time in your life and maybe the years leading up to this moment in your life.
Sure. So This was in Spearfish, South Dakota, so that's where I graduated high school. And my mom had moved myself and my sister, I was the oldest, from Pine Ridge Reservation where we grew up. And she decided to go back to school, and she went to Black Hills State University. And so she, she was a single mom raising 2 kids, and that's kind of how I started working in restaurants, just because we didn't have a lot of money coming right off of the reservation, and so I got a job right away as soon as I was, I went from a paper route to a kitchen job, basically.
Yeah.
And so I got my first kitchen job when I was 13 and just worked restaurants around the northern Black Hills there.
Okay.
And then during this time period, actually, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service around when I was a senior in high school and into that summer. Okay. And that job really helped my path in the future, because I had to learn the names of all the trees and plants in the northern Black Hills. Mm-hmm. And it just kind of gave me a base foundation of education, of just connecting with the environment around you. And I had, grown up on Pine Ridge, where we had foraged some things growing up. We had like wild prairie turnips that we called timsala that a lot of families harvested, a lot of choke cherries and stuff like that. But when I was that age and working in the Black Hills, and it was such a perfect job, I thought, because I basically would get up, drive a beat-up old pickup truck to the middle of nowhere in the Black Hills, and walk to this area and do a big survey. And I'd spend my day just by myself in the forest, and sit down and have lunch in the middle of nowhere and all the kinds of things. And a lot of good memories of that time period. Yeah. But definitely trying to search for what I wanted to do, because I had no idea I was going to become a chef. That was a complete accident. And I just worked restaurants all through high school and college, and after college moved to Minnesota and continued to work restaurants. I moved here to go to MCAD, but I still didn't have any money at that age. So when they showed me how much MCAD costs, it's like, well, I guess art will be a hobby from this point forward. But I have created a really nice relationship with MCAD over the years, so it's still a really great school. But it did set me on a path, because I found art through a different format. I found art through food, because I could do dinners, I could tell a story with a plate, and the food choices you make things look beautiful and pretty, and that always kind of stuck with me. And so, it's been a long journey to get here, but when I did find the path of doing what I'm doing with the focus of Indigenous foods and just understanding the knowledge that my ancestors held about the food around us, the world around us, that everything just helped me get there. I was always on the path. I always had a foot on the path, at least, looking backwards.
Yeah, not even recognizing the path that you were completely heading down, but your foot was there.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did Indigenous food look to you growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation?
Well, we hunted a lot, so I got my first shotgun when I was probably 7 or something like that, and we got a lot of birds. There was a lot of pheasant and grouse. There was some antelope and some venison around us. We do ducks and geese sometimes. But lots of pheasant and grouse mostly, because that was just what was around us. And so we all grew up with guns back then, because we just lived on a ranch, and it was like a tool that we had. And then we did harvest some of the wild plants, like I said, but for the large part, a lot of our foods were just missing from the food scene. Because reservation systems are still modern day segregated communities when it comes down to it. And we didn't have a lot of food access, because Pine Ridge is about the size of Connecticut, and we had one grocery store to service that entire area. So very little healthy food access, very little food access. So a lot of our food came from Commodity Food Program. And Commodity Food Program is a government subsidy program that just gives a lot of staples out to tribal communities, and you see the same stuff in school systems and hospitals and even military and stuff like that too. But just lots of canned vegetables that are just packed in sodium, lots of canned fruits that are packed in sugars and corn syrups typically, and just lots of things. We literally just get gallons of corn syrup, and that's what we would use for a lot of sugar and sweeteners and powdered milk and government cheese and all the things, lots of carbs and starches. So that food program is still alive and very much still a problematic issue, and a big part of what we do, a lot of this work, is to try to fix some of these things that need to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. So did the disparity in access to healthy food, did that kind of help propel your mission forward when you were younger? Hey, I know there's something different than this, and I want to push that forward.
I'm curious, because I grew up in an era where we still read a lot of books. I didn't have a lot of TV growing up. We spent a lot of time outdoors. And I loved books, so I just read a lot ever since I was very young, and that was just a big part of that, my own education, I guess. But I think that everything kind of added up, and I was very curious. Like, I remember growing up, and my grandmother had pretty much every National Geographic that had been published. So I would just spend hours digging through those old magazines and just learning about different regions of the world and stuff like that. So I was always very curious about history and food history and world history and those kinds of things. So when I realized that my passion and my path was going to be food, I always carried that with me. I always carried a lot of self-education and just thinking about where things come from and all those kinds of pieces. So, I naturally kind of moved into the farm-to-table movement early on in like the early 2000s, and just connected with a lot of local people growing things, and still have a lot of those connections today. We've been working with the same people for over 20 years now. And it's just been really great to see, like, that part's been so normalized. Like, it's almost hard to not go to a restaurant and see some local food on the menu somewhere on there, which is so needed. But everything kind of leaded towards this. But for me, with the Indigenous focus, it's just realizing a lot of these inequalities that are still very much alive. And just trying to take steps to find solutions to make things better for future generations.
Which is admirable and applaudable. Did you have a mentor during that time who was kind of like, believed in your visions and believed in your dreams and your goals? Was there someone who was kind of pulling you along in that?
Not really. I kind of did a lot of this on my own. I just was a lot of self-study. I had the vision of doing this work when I moved from Minneapolis, and I moved down to San Pancho on the Pacific coast there, a little north of Puerto Vallarta, which I know you guys know.
Absolutely. I'm impressed you came back to Minnesota.
Right? But I kept going back down that way. I just loved Mexico, and I just lived on the beach, and San Pancho way back then too, because I think I moved down there in 2008, 2007. I think was the first time I actually lived there for a little while. And I remember I was down there during the housing crash, which would have been around 2008. And that froze up a lot of money, but it also, stopped a lot of this kind of overdevelopment that was starting to happen there. So that was kind of nice to see everything slow down and just kind of stay the way it was, because there weren't too many Mexico's interesting. Like, if you go to the Cancun, Tulum side, you can't even really find any land space on the ocean to go to. Everything's privatized, and then those tourist dollars, nothing really actually goes back to those communities. And then so San Pancho on the other side of Mexico at that time was just such a small, beautiful little town. It was still just a community, and there's a little bit more tourism there today, but it's still pretty quaint, So I just found it really a great place to be. And while I was living down there, I just kind of had this epiphany of just realizing my path, because I was really curious about the Huichol, which is the native group down there. And I became very curious about their foodways, and something just opened up that I just realized the absence of knowledge of my own heritage food, because it just wasn't around, and just realized there was a complete invisibility around Indigenous peoples, Indigenous culture, especially in the food scene. And in just that stark contrast of living in these beautiful food cities where you can find amazing restaurants and food from all over the world, but nothing that represented the land we were standing on. And so it just was really eye-opening to me, and it set me on a path that I'm still on and always will be now.
I love that you're paving a voice in this space, because I was listening to some of your podcasts preparing, and I'm like, why is that? I mean, why are there so many other different cultures and food histories so readily available, and there's not in the Indigenous space? I mean, it's you for the most part, and I mean, thank God there's you, but why has that been so slow to come forward?
It's just the history, because we live in a very, the history of America is very short. There hasn't been a lot of time that's passed. We don't have a lot of history, because when I do my speaking engagements, I break down history into two big chunks of 1800 to 1900, and then 1900 to basically now. And then so you look at that first chunk, and in the year 1800, the United States government's still at war with Great Britain. They're still battling with France. The western frontier is Ohio, still at that point in time. And there are really not much more than 13 states, the 13 colonies originally. And then but during that one century, we see just so much extreme violence against the Indigenous peoples, because Indigenous peoples, the biggest value that they had was the land that they stood on, which made it really dangerous to be Indigenous, as this really aggressive young government was doing everything they can to acquire as much land space as possible, because the United States government realizes by acquiring the land spaces, they're able to commodify it, sell it, and they make an immense amount of money privatizing and selling all this open land space, which was actually stewarded by Indigenous peoples for countless generations, and still, at that point in time. So, that century is a really important century to understand, like, how intentional the United States government was moving to displace Indigenous communities, and the amount of violence that was being allowed to take place and occur, especially during that century. Especially it ramps up in the middle of that century. And we're taught with where we are today to kind of uphold colonial history and to appreciate this colonial history, when the actuality and factuality of that situation is that there's just so much violence and so much atrocity, and we just really need to name it for what it is, and because I think anybody of color, but especially Black and Indigenous in America, has to really stand up to showcase and to name, like, this really awful history that happened to all of us, and we have to really do it together, So this work becomes even more important because there's a reason why there aren't Native American restaurants in every single city, and it's because of that history. It's because of land access. It's because of privilege and family wealth and all sorts of factors. And so there's a lot of work to do, but we see a very clear path with the nonprofit, with the restaurant, and everything that we're doing to help open up doors for more Indigenous peoples and people of color in general, and just to really push back against the normalcy of what colonialism has been for us here in this land space, and to do something different, and to be more intentional with our food choices, and be more intentional about how we talk about race and history and culture and things like that, and showcase an immense amount of beautiful diversity across the board.
And I think that capacity to be willing to unlearn, which when you and I crossed paths, you kind of became a new history teacher for me. In that request of having the land recognition up at the Point Retreats, I had to do a lot of digging, and you recommended this book, which I did bring today because I just want to show people, because I think it's how to learn a more accurate version of our history that most of us probably didn't learn in school, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And Sean asked me to read this book before he came up to the Point Retreats, and it was hard.
It's pretty intense.
I mean, it was a hard and humbling and, like, just a deep read.
Yeah, and she has to cut out a lot of pieces because you can't fit everything in, but it gives you a picture at least. And when I talked with her directly, I did an interview with her personally, and I talked to her and I said, when I finished this book, to me it was really almost like an essay on U.S. militarism.
Yeah.
And she said that's actually what it started out to be. She said it was really chronicling how our U.S. military is still, starting from Indian Wars in the very beginning days, is still, like, chasing after this never-ending frontier, Now we have Space Force.
It's true. Yeah. Boy, we've come so far. Yeah. But you bring up a really, I mean, it's such an important, like, point, and it's so ironic to me because, when you go back to, I mean, so many pieces of the Indigenous history, culture, food, coming from a background in healthcare, I look, and as I've been studying more about the kind of the modern Indigenous food system, right, that you're bringing forward, it could solve so many of our problems around health. How do you kind of absorb all of these fad diets that you see, like, popping up and popping up and popping up and popping up, and you're like, this has actually been around for hundreds of years. Like, I have a book about it. I mean, how do you compare and contrast those two, like the fad diets versus what you've known for hundreds of years?
I don't think we need to worry about the fad diets too much, because people keep coming up and everybody's got good intentions for what they're attempting to do, and some people are just trying to commercialize and make money. It is what it is, but for the most part, like, we should just be thinking about what we put in our body, and we should be learning from Indigenous peoples, because I believe Indigenous peoples on a global scale have the key to help save us, because they had the privilege of having countless and thousands of generations of education to give them the blueprint to live sustainably with the world around us. So it's that vast knowledge of all these plants around us, which our Western diets have largely ignored, because if most people look at this beautiful little wild space outside the window, most people won't be able to name the trees or the shrubs or the grasses or anything like that. They just see weeds and trees, you know, and we need to be a lot better. We need to have a better connection with the world around us to know how things grow and move. And we're in a different era now, so it's not like things can be exactly the same for my ancestors, what they saw around them, because we have a lot more introduced plants, and it's just there's a lot of different things. But you have to use the indigenous perspective of learning, like all these plants and trees, like we could create a relationship with them somehow. There could have something that we can work with them. It could be food, it could be medicine, it could be crafting, but it's creating a respect for the world around us. And that's a commonality that indigenous peoples hold on a global scale. And so we're just doing everything we can to try to create systems that help steward those knowledge bases, bring them forward so we can learn from them and start to apply some of those lessons right now today.
Yeah, absolutely. And does that bring into like the lawns are stupid concept?
Yeah, pretty much, because lawns are stupid. And
there should be a t-shirt.
I know.
With Owamni.
Yeah, lawns are stupid, and they're a waste of space, and it's just a good example of like what are we doing, you know? Because we spend all this time and energy on this monocrop that you can't do anything with, at all really, and we should just be allowing plants that really like to grow because it's better for the soil. So we should be really looking at permacultural education, and just because that's how indigenous peoples, they were just utilizing and tending the wild around them, you know. So the forests had clear paths to where all the different foods and medicines were. They knew how to harvest, when to harvest, songs to sing as they harvest, and so much relationship and respect going into this symbiotic relationship with the world around us, basically, and not being superior to the world, but being a part of it. And so there's a lot we can learn, and things like I use lawns are stupid as a situation just to get people to think about that for a second, and I pick on Palm Springs because Palm Springs, there's 120 golf courses in the middle of the desert, and if you fly over there, you have all this green space, and it shouldn't look like that. But if we have the technology to like do that, what if, just imagine what it would be if we were using that technology for food, instead of like making golfers happy and just creating food for everybody, especially people that need food, and plus it's just a place of like so much privilege because we're going into water crisis, especially in California, and the amount of water that those kinds of spaces are utilizing is insane, so we just need to be a lot smarter moving forward in the future about all of our natural resources and our land spaces, and thinking, and why not just grow food everywhere, and why not just put plants that can propagate food and help us create pantries for our communities and create systems where we can harvest and preserve and and share a lot of this natural world around us.
Which is kind of a lost art, really, as coming from an artist, right? Like, time and just awareness in nature is a lost art. Like, we are, like this most of the time, right? On our phones or on our computers. And so just being aware of what's around us is such a good starting point to just think about food differently.
Absolutely.
Which feels really foreign because we usually don't think about food unless we're like, halfway in our pantry or, running through the grocery store, but looking outside. And I will tell you, I observed Sean when he was at the point, and he went outside and he was foraging. And it was just like beautiful to watch you out there doing that and finding things that I would have never thought to use in food. And he came back and made this incredible cedar and maple tea that to this day, like, I would drive all the way from Minneapolis to my home in Afton to like just go have this tea. It's so good. And if you haven't had a chance to try it, I would highly recommend it. But it didn't take a lot to find those ingredients.
No, right outside your window.
Right outside the window.
Yeah.
And we just don't even think about it.
Right.
Yeah. Can I ask you, when it comes to food, like, what's something your elders taught you about food that you want, that impacted your path, and then what's something you want to make sure you pass on to the next generation about food?
I think, growing up with a lot of Lakota values on Pine Ridge Reservation, that food was always something that was very, it was given. Like, people were very generous. Even when people had very little and there was very little food, people were very open. If you were hungry, then there was food available. Yeah. And I think, we can be better about, keeping an eye on our community and our neighbors and all these things. Like, we silo ourselves, so much in today's society. And we live in these little tiny worlds that you hold in your hand, and we need to be a little bit more open and better. And so I think, some of those values, and, in Lakota religion, spirituality, there's just, there's so much, you have a connection to basically everything, because there's like an energy that just lives in everything, the biggest mountain to the smallest tree, and all the animals and all the humans and all the things. And, it's just a beautiful outlook on how things are connected to each other, So I think a lot of those little pieces have always helped a little bit, to be very giving, to see when people are in need of food, and, to identify privileges that are out there that aren't talked about, and to, again, just, if we have the ability to, then why not do something to make a difference?
Right. So can I ask you, we see now kind of all of the accolades and the big achievements, and those are beautiful and wonderful and phenomenal, but I know your path hasn't always been like linear, right? You've had a lot of ups and downs and trials and tribulations, and I will say, coming from a background in healthcare, which is full of stress and burnout, thanks to Chef Nick and Chef Angela, who's here too, like I've learned that there's probably a great parallel between healthcare and the culinary world in terms of stress and burnout, because it is insanely demanding. And owning a restaurant, I think, is probably one of the most demanding and challenging businesses to start. So how do you protect your own health and well-being and prevent burnout in the midst of all of this madness in the world, where it's like there's this beauty that and this wisdom that and staying connected to all the energy around you? And how do you do that when swirling around you is a lot of chaos and demand?
I think that spending most of my adult years working in restaurants and managing restaurants and being in the kitchens, and restaurants are just thinly veiled chaos machines, and they just it's just a matter of trying to control that chaos the best you can every day, because every day something will happen, and you just get prepared to be a problem solver. You figure things out as it comes at you.
Yeah. And you had one of those just this week.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Which I don't know if everyone knows, but Owamni had an electrical fire, which had a significant impact on the restaurant and is currently closed.
Absolutely, yeah. And then nothing we could do, and it was just a perfect storm of snow melt coming into the building through some of the conduits, and having to drip on the most important electrical panel in the entire building, and shutting down the whole space for who knows, for the rest of this month and into next month.
Oh my goodness, which is a long time. Like,
it's
as a business owner, that's a really long time.
Yeah, and luckily our insurance is cooperating with us. I was a little nervous about that, but it seems like they're kicking in and doing their thing. So we are going to recoup some of the lost profits and our sales, and we'll also be able to pay staff, for a while. But so just cross our fingers that they're able to move fast and get us reopened again, because it's just the nature of businesses and restaurants in general.
You seem so cool, calm, and collected. Like, you've been time,
well, there's
100%
nothing I
of the
could
year,
do.
you got a fire, and you're just like, it's all fine. But have you ever been burnt out? Like, has it ever gotten to you to the point where you're like, okay, this is not working?
Absolutely, and that's why I moved down to Mexico officially the first time, because I was working for Lifetime. And I was overseeing menus and menu and recipe development for about 80 locations across the nation, and I was overseeing 4 full-scale restaurants in the city that Lifetime had at the same time, and that was a lot. And I wasn't really being that fairly compensated for the immense amount of work I was doing, because there was literally 100-hour work weeks there in the mix. So after a couple to like 2.5 years of that, I kind of definitely hit a burnout. So I just packed a guitar and a backpack and moved to Mexico and waited for the next phase of life.
And so how long were you in Mexico then, to just kind of recover and regroup?
I kept coming back. So I remember when I left that job and I just moved down to Mexico, I was there for about 4 months. And then I came back to the States. I took a chef job in the Black Hills for a summer just to save up some cash. And then I moved back down, and I was there for about 8.5 months, I think, that next time around.
I can see where that burnout was really high.
Yeah.
How about during the pandemic? Like, the whole world changed so quickly, and I know your world changed really quickly. So how did you shift during that time? What did you do? Yeah,
that was a crazy time, because we were still pretty small at that time. We were a catering company, and we were a decent-sized catering company. We were a little over $1 million in sales, but not gigantic, but decent enough to have about 20 plus employees at that time period. And then we were really excited because we had been working on a capital campaign to open up Indigenous Food Lab and find a building space for that. And we had found one at the Midtown Global Market. So we started moving in there in January of 2020. And originally the Food Lab was going to have a restaurant attached to it. So we were taking over this large kitchen space that used to be this business called Kitchen in the Market, where they had a large commercial kitchen in a classroom, which was a part of the needs that we had for the nonprofit. And they had a full-scale restaurant, which was the Rabbit Hole. So we were going to take over all that. And then, so I remember we were pretty much moved in by the end of January. February, we were just kind of going back and forth with negotiations and leases and lawyers and things. And then at the end of February, I was like, well, I'm going to run down to Mexico to San Pancho for my birthday. And when I get back, we'll sign these leases and we'll call it good. And everybody's like, cool. So I remember leaving on the 28th of February or something, and I didn't get back to the 12th. But during that time period, everything changed. So as we were down there, it grew so quickly. But San Francisco shuts down, New York shuts down, Seattle shuts down, and it's like Minneapolis is right behind that. So when we got back, all of our catering had disappeared completely, and it was such a crazy time. So we just packed everything up, didn't sign the leases, luckily, for the moment, and waited it out like everybody did. And then just a few weeks later, George Floyd happens right next to us, because we're just right on Lake Street and Chicago, and just like 8 blocks south is where he's murdered. And obviously everything down Lake Street just got torn up, and every building around us just got burned down. So that's when we started just moving back in during the height of the pandemic and just doing food relief. So we were doing about 400 meals a day in the style of what we do, just kind of sending out healthy Indigenous foods. And as the winter kind of came around, we started working with tribal communities, and we were sending out 10,000 healthy meals a week out of that small kitchen with a staff of about 12 people.
I mean, to me, that's like a bigger applause than like Time 100 Most Influential People. I mean,
well,
what you shifted and did was amazing.
And we were able to find monies, and our philosophy, of course, was trying to save and utilize a lot of our local vendors, because they also got stuck. So we weren't trying to take in a lot of these, people like Cisco's and U.S. Foods and stuff were giving out foods and things, which was great when we divert those. But we were trying to raise money to purchase all these foods so we can support the local growers too at the same time, which we did really well. But it was a crazy time period. And then we turned around and opened up a restaurant.
Right. In the middle of
in the middle of the pandemic,
the vaccines and masks and all of that.
Vaccine mandates, mask mandates, all these things, and that was definitely a challenging time.
Absolutely. But you were solving pieces of that puzzle, right? Like you realized there was a food scarcity issue, and you realized probably those most in need were getting the least amount. And then other businesses that were also suffering, like food growers. What you created during that time solved a lot of problems throughout the pandemic, which is really impressive, to shift your mindset of being like, I'm going to open a restaurant, to now I'm going to, serve those that need it the most. Just such a huge shift. So that's just incredible. And I spent one day in the kitchen when you were doing all that. And
the food relief.
Your whole team is incredible. And I'll point out Grandma Janice. She was out there a few times, and I think a few others in the community. But like Sean and his team pulled together this huge pool of volunteers, and you're making it. And I'm telling you, like, I wanted to just grab a dish and eat it. It's not like what you think of when you go to your normal food kitchen. It was beautiful, healthy, fresh food. And then you had coordinated, getting everything out to everybody. And it was so impressive what you did in such a short amount of time in the midst of, most of us here experienced George Floyd, right? You know how Minneapolis was, how it was there, and it was devastating, on top of the global pandemic. So, high five to you. Serious. It's incredible. And now you've and I'd want to interject too. So part of what I want to mention to everybody here who's listening or in the audience is Sean does have a nonprofit called NATIFS, and maybe you can talk a little bit more specifically about that too. That is really to restore a lot of the Indigenous history, culture, in particular around food. And so if you are interested in learning more, we will put more in the show notes. You can also make a donation in the back there with Mariah. She has it pulled up on the iPad. It's a phenomenal nonprofit to support. So if you don't mind talking a little bit about NATIFS, and then also kind of your next venture, which I had a little snippet of at an event you hosted in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago with
Sure.
your partner and soulmate, Mecca. Yeah.
Yeah, so NATIFS is kind of the big work that I'm really pushing into. So it's an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. We got our 501c3 status back in early 2019, I think. And under under NATIFS, we have a public-facing entity called Indigenous Food Lab that's right now housed in Midtown Global Market on Lake Street in South. And we're about ready to launch a native market space. So it's been a while in the making, but it'll be a place where just the community will have at least one place to go and find cool indigenous food products. So we'll have a bunch of different kinds of corns from different nations around the U.S. and some in Mexico and some in Canada. A bunch of different wild rice from different regions and different communities, maple, and just whatever products. There's a decent amount of indigenous food products out there, and we're just trying to center it so people have kind of a one-stop shop to find all these cool things.
Yeah.
And the Food Lab does a lot of food production too, because we were doing all that food relief for a while, but we have also been processing and making a lot of food for the restaurant, but we'll be able to sell a lot of that stuff. So we nixtamalize a ton of corn every day. We make a bunch of fresh tortillas using native corns and heirloom varietals of native corns. And we just make a lot of products. And we even have a USDA licensing to be kind of a micro to mid-sized co-packer to help more indigenous cottage industry get products out there in the market.
Yeah.
And we just finished our first pilot program with that by working with a group in Minneapolis called the Indigenous Peoples Task Force, and they grew out a whole bunch of garden vegetables, and we processed that into baby food and co-packed it, and now they have these beautiful little jars of indigenous baby food called Indigibaby.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
And it's
that is
super all
brilliant.
natural and heirloom varietals of seeds and all the things, and it's just really
Wow.
beautiful. And then so hopefully we'll be able to see more and more of that coming up in the future. And our goal is really just to be a support system to help other entrepreneurs or tribal communities develop more healthy food operations. So we're working with some of the tribes in Minnesota, and we just really want to help them to develop systems where they can have healthy food access somehow. It could be a full-scale restaurant model. It could be a catering team working out of one of their elders or community centers or something like that. But we can help with recipe design, menu design. We can help with food distribution. And in the market space, I'm making a plan to get smaller extensions of that out there, especially in the rural areas where some places like might have a gas station as their only food source for like 50 miles or something like that, which is real, that's out there. So I want to create a really easy to repopulate kind of end cap kind of situations where you just have a couple shelving units and you just get these little convenience stores to give up a shelf of chips and just curate a bunch of cool indigenous food products there, and just trying to work on that system to create more distribution points. And then with Indigenous Food Lab, we also have a big focus on Indigenous education. So some of that is just identifying what Indigenous education is, which is just countless generations of knowledge that would have been handed down to us as Indigenous peoples to live with the world around us. It's a teaching of everything. It's wild foods and medicine and crafting and language and stories and religion and food and culinary and food preservation and farming and all these things. So there's a whole bunch of pieces of that fall into what is Indigenous education, and from a non-Eurocentric academia point of view. So we created a little classroom in Midtown Global where we're going to be hosting a lot of classwork. So it could be a class on nixtamalizing corn, or it could be a language class, or it could be a crafting class, or it could be all sorts of things. But everything we do, we bought a lot of really great video stuff, so we record every little piece, and that'll get edited and put on our website, and we're just going to create a huge trove of Indigenous-focused videos for people to watch and learn from. And so then after that piece, I do a lot of connection with a lot of higher education and universities, and we're creating a lot of collaboration so we can start to take on a lot more joint research and development projects together and just continue to build our own knowledge base of Indigenous everything when it comes down to it. And we're ready to create extensions of Indigenous Food Lab, so we're already planting seeds to build extensions of Indigenous Food Lab in cities like Anchorage, Bozeman, Rapid City, possibly Honolulu. And we're going to continue to grow outwards beyond and just become regional center points for more development. And even I've been doing a lot more international travel over the past few years, but I'm always running into the same situation because I just got back from Australia, which is a very similar story for the Indigenous peoples there, with a very violent, very racist country taking over a lot of land spaces, and they're even further behind us when it comes down to it. So there's a lot of amazing work to do for this to happen basically on a global scale in the future. And knowing that these are very ambitious plans, but in my mind, like, this doesn't have to happen in my lifetime, that we're just trying to build a structure and a foundation for this to continue to grow and to have a lot more open doors for other people in the future to take this and build it to be even bigger.
Your plans sound really big. They sound really comprehensive, which is amazing. I'm just sitting here in my mind going, I don't know that you've left like any stone unturned. Like you've thought of this from A to Z, and I know you have the drive and the capacity and now the influence to really make a lot of this happen, but you still need support. There's
a lot of
still
support, and a lot of it
momentum.
is, building the right team and getting everybody motivated and just keeping everything moving forward. We have a lot of amazing opportunity, and it's just going to be a lot of learnings along the way, but, we're going to do everything we can to see this vision through.
And you seem very patient.
Yeah,
like driven,
you have
but
to
patient.
be. You have to be.
Yeah.
Because things take time.
Okay, so I'm getting some cues in the back. I'm going to turn it over to the audience and just one more question.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So I know all of this has led you to a place most of us will not get to in the capacity that you've been, which is the White House, right? So in the last year, you've gone to the White House, I think twice, if I'm not mistaken. And would love to hear a little bit about your experience there. And were there even any elements of it that were really bittersweet, given the history of our country and being there?
Yeah, absolutely, because again, there's just a lot of not great history between especially U.S. presidents and Indigenous peoples, especially in the 1800s too. So again, there's just a lot of this uplifting of this kind of colonial perspective and viewpoints, and there's some large paintings of like ships coming in, and you can see the Indigenous peoples kind of looking over, and there's just little snippets here and there across the board. So it is obviously the center of colonization, when it comes down to it for the U.S., even though, of course, that building was built a little bit later than some of the history, but still, it houses a lot of the power and direction, and it's been a rough go, and that's why it's important for people to read books like this to see, like even somebody like President Lincoln was awful towards Indigenous peoples, and we just have to really name it again for what it is and really identify those histories. And we live in such a weird time period because they're making histories illegal in some states. They're saying African history is not needed, and stuff like that. And they're changing entire textbooks to go along the whims with some of these politicians. And we should not let politicians decide our education or food systems when it comes down to it.
I agree. Yes. So can we nominate you for president while we're here? So do you feel like they're calling you in because there are some with open ears, minds, hearts who want to learn and want to do things better?
Yeah, so we've been there for a couple things. So the first time we went, there was a big gala because it was Native American Heritage Month in November, and for the first time ever, they gave it attention at the White House. So the First Lady was there, Deb Haaland was there, and we had about 600 natives hanging out there, and everybody's dressed up, and it was a beautiful event. And then the next one, I was selected to be a part of this American Culinary Corps with about 50 other chefs from around the nation to represent the U.S. in the future for various food culinary projects or bringing in other dignitaries or things like that. So we all gathered in D.C. To be a part of that, and that was handed off to us by Secretary Blinken. I think that's his title. Which is funny because his name is A is Anthony.
Oh, is it? So
Blinken.
His initials are. Oh,
isn't that funny?
That is kind of weird. Like, can you
Once
say
you
that
hear
one
that, you
more
can't
time?
unhear it. It's just A Blinken.
Yeah, you're like, I did not catch Anthony. Yeah.
But he gave us fancy chef coats, and we have a cool team of chefs for that. So that was a fun venture too.
What an honor and a privilege. And again, it's just like another space where you're bringing something, a perspective that's much needed in a space where it needs to be heard. So yeah, just again, kudos to you for being there. I mean, you're impacting the Minneapolis community and so far beyond that. So very powerful in your work. Yeah. Okay, so I could keep going, but I think I need to stop and let everyone else ask questions. So please feel free to come up to the mic and just maybe give your name, introduce yourself, and feel free to ask your question. I know it's always hard to decide who's going to go first. I could call someone up. Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John. First of all, thanks for this. It's been amazing. My question is, with your own success, and I'm thinking of the success of other folks like, the show Reservation Dogs, for instance, and like Joe Rainey, to name a couple. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's a lot more representation of Indigenous culture in popular culture right now. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you think there's a particular reason why now, and I'm also curious if there's any kind of communication between you and other artists out there, and what that's like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of connection because, I knew a lot of the people who are part of the writing for Res Dogs and stuff like that, because they had a comedy group called 1491s, and they were from I think three of them are from Minnesota. Their family's from around Red Lake. And it was just really great to see that platform being built and for them to really use that craft of comedy, but also realism. So it was such a great show. And, it's just, there's a space out there for just more Indigenous everything. And I think that after going through all this history of, so much violence and annihilation in the 1800s and, so much segregation and racism in the 1900s, that we're at this era of reclamation where people are seeing that they can stand up and be proud of their indigeneity. They can, really put it out there. And there's a lot more, there's a lot more equity happening in some of those spaces too. So there's a lot more search for true stories coming from people of color. So we're seeing it in all facets, but it's definitely a great time to see so much energy being put into bringing Indigenous peoples into these spaces to tell their stories and whatever art form they might be doing. And, there's just a large movement happening out there. So we're seeing a ton of Native chefs coming up out of this behind us, and we're seeing, more and more of these cool shows and movies and actors and things like that. And there's just, it's getting out there, and it should be. We should be able to appreciate Indigenous cultures without having to appropriate them, because for so long we've just seen Native caricatures out there all over the place, whether it's on a box of butter or a sports team logo or whatever it is, and as Indigenous peoples, we should be able to have the time and space to really showcase the beauty of our diversity and to showcase who we truly are and not be a caricature,
Yeah, that's a good question, John. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Multiple choice, please.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Renee Savakis, and my question is, since Stillwater was just named the food city of this state, when are you going to open a restaurant there? And then my second question is, when can we be hired? Because I have some friends back there, and we're all ready to work for you.
Nice. Yeah, well, my hopes are with our nonprofit efforts that, we can help many other people open up a whole bunch of things. We just want to help erase hurdles. I just worked with my friend Crystal Wapipa, who opened up a restaurant in Oakland called Wapipa's Kitchen, and we were able to help her get her doors open, and we just want to use our resources to help people, and I personally never really wanted a restaurant particularly, but a restaurant is a really important thing because it's a place where people can come and try things. Yeah. It's really just, and for me, Owamni is just kind of it's a proof of concept to showcase that a restaurant like this with all its intention can exist in today's world, and that we can have an entire healthy restaurant without calling it a health food restaurant, and be excited about it because, we're, with our philosophy, if you haven't had our food before, part of our philosophy was just cutting out colonial ingredients to showcase what was truly Indigenous to our land spaces, trying to purchase as much as we can from Indigenous producers first to showcase those products. So we removed things like wheat flour, cane sugar, dairy products, beef, pork, chicken, and there's just a ton of amazing things that we come up with without using those things. So it's almost more powerful what's not on the menu, So, we happen to be gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, like all those things that all the fad diets are trying to get to. And it just happens to be the indigenous diet of North America. And so and there's a lot to explore, there's a lot to understand. And we can do the same work basically all over the world, So it's just identifying and reclaiming and allowing indigenous and, peoples from all these different spaces to be able to be the ones that tells a story, because for too long, obviously Americans are really good at just bastardizing basically everything, and it's been so normal to just see everything bastardized, and to see like chefs coming out and being experts on other people's cuisines and things like that, and like discovering Oaxaca or something like that, and like those languages are just kind of dangerous, I feel like. So we're in a better space where people are stepping back and allowing people from communities to really talk about their own cultures and to bring that forward, instead of having like a white savior come in kind of situation and make it safe for other white people. So there's just there's a lot of work out there, but we're seeing some changes out there, so it's a positive time.
Absolutely. And as the birthplace of Minnesota, right? I think you're onto something there. Yes. But to your point, I mean, it's just that we're finally elevating the communities, the voices that have needed to be elevated and heard and respected, and let that piece of our history just shine like it should.
Yeah, and indigenous peoples have so much to offer, especially from their own perspectives of history too, because like Owamni is named after what used to be a beautiful waterfall right outside where the restaurant sits on the river there, and where now there's a lock and dam there and a big concrete skirting, because when the colonial time period came in and they started building all the mills down to what is downtown Minneapolis, that they started damaging like a lot of these natural features by digging tunnels and things under, and one big tunnel actually collapsed, so they had to bring in the Army Corps of Engineers and develop what we see today, which is this big lock and dam and concrete skirting. But for the Dakota people that lived there for countless generations, there was a really large community right there on that side of the river by where the restaurant's at, and the waterfall that was outside used to be 300 feet across and about 40 feet down, so it was a massive drop, and it was really beautiful. And so the Dakota people called it Awami Omni, which meant the place of the falling, swirling water. And it was a really special place because it was a place where people could portage. There was a lot of trade that happened there. It was also moving a lot of just food products and stuff, because the riverways are the highways back then. So it's a really important space in history. So when we took the name Owamni, it was just using the short name that just describes the area around the waterfall, which is today downtown Minneapolis, So it's just really important to know that there's a lot of stories out there still today of, from that history doesn't start with colonial history, because typically there's, pretty much everywhere in colonialism, there's always somebody else living there first, so there's stories before that we should be really focused on and understanding, and again, like our American history likes to start at colonialism and go from there, when we really should be including a lot of these amazing diverse stories of creation and cultures and things that come from here first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, do a deeper dive.
Yeah, and we can.
Take the time. Absolutely. And you've taken a lot of time to be very intentional, and even just taking symbolism that's really relevant and important in upholding the history of the area with Owamni, right? So, we could stop there and just go, oh, it's this restaurant called Owamni. Like, take that time to just think, like, what goes beyond that? Like, what's behind that name?
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
we don't tend to do. Yeah. So, next question. Yeah, Rebecca.
Bring out my squeaky shoes. Sneak up on anybody. I am a nurse practitioner that works in endocrinology, and the preponderance of my practice, that's hard to say a couple of times, preponderance of your practice, is diabetes. And you just talked about many things, I'm sure you saw me shaking my head back there, that have caused, it's the diet that runs a good portion of type 2 diabetes. And it's very, it's rampant in the people of color, particularly the Indigenous society. So do you have ideas about how we can return folks to an Indigenous diet and cure them of their ills, their colonial diet?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our work with the nonprofit is that we're trying to tackle instances like that, because some of our indigenous communities can have up to 60% type 2 diabetes rates, you know, and you just see a lot of obesity and a lot of the illnesses that come from that, whether it's heart disease and basically everything else, you know. So there's a direct connection to food access and health when it comes down to it. And you know, there's a lot of privilege in our food system, and there's a lot of people out there, because on Pine Ridge, like, I think the unemployment rate's still in the 80 percentile, and you know, I've seen statistics where the average take-home wage for people is about $2,500 a year, and that's average for an entire community of like 50,000 people, right? So there's a lot of work to do, and you know, if you go to Pine Ridge today, you know, I think there's a couple fast food restaurants now down there, and there's still the one grocery store, and there's a few gas stations around, and most people just eat crappy food, and it's just the way it is. And so our hopes are that we can get one tribal community to work with us to really think about really investing into a lot more community garden, into a lot more permaculture design, and creating a lot more healthy food in that practice, but also figuring out efforts to use the community to play a role in helping to harvest and collect and preserve the foods to create the pantry items, which is why we need a lot of commercial kitchens and teachings around that to utilize a lot more modern resources to process these foods faster and easier. And then just, you know, create a large community pantry, because that's how indigenous communities on the global scale had worked forever. Like, they took an entire community to deal with your food system. And so we need to see a lot more of that. So we need a lot more we just really want to see a lot more food security with people utilizing what's around them, you know, and being less reliant on government programs and things like that. Because that's where it's going to change. And, you know, we think that working with, you know, if we get one tribal community to start to work with us, they have a lot of sovereign rights where they can start to rewrite some of their own food codes, and they can really do things differently and become a role model of how you can turn something around that's been not great into something that can be really good. So we're going to continue to kind of push a lot of effort into education, especially around the growth of food and production of food, but also the packaging and preservation of foods, to be able to utilize them. But even, you know, you could use the same process, because even like in a city, like, instead of having, you know, some of these giant park areas, like, we could have food forests, you know, we could turn land spaces into food production, and we could just allow it to be wild food production, where we just plant a lot of trees and a lot of plants and things that like to grow well, you know. So a lot of times when I'm doing education on wild food, sometimes I'll take people down to the Eloise Butler garden, and I can't harvest anything out of there, but I can showcase, like, this is what Minnesota should look like, you know, and it's just filled with food everywhere you look. Like, every plant there has something that you can utilize, and again, like, they treat it like a museum piece, because you can't touch it, and then all this food just dies on the ground, and then it pops back again next year. But maybe if they had more intentional systems, they could harvest things when it's ready and know how to do it without damaging it, to propagate it, and then take all of the harvest and preserve it and put it into a community pantry to help offset some of the food needs of the community, you know. So there's plenty of ways we can really rethink about our food system, and a lot of it's going to have to be a community effort, a lot of volunteer work, but there's a lot of people who would be willing to spend some time helping to create food for people in need, you know. So some of these systems are doable, and again, it's just to be a matter of, you know, figuring out people and ways to help make this happen, and getting some cities on board to, you know, putting some resources into something like this, because there's a lot of education around this, and getting kids involved with it, like just getting kids outdoors to identify a few plants and be a part of that is huge, you know. So we got to start early with our children. I always tease that our kids can name more of Kim Kardashian's ex-boyfriends than they can tree species, you know.
That's very sad, but probably true. Yes. Yeah. But kind of trying to break through those mindsets that, without minimizing the hardship around living on a really tight and small budget and trying to eat healthy. But, you know, we tend to come in with like these fast, quick, unhealthy solutions, versus there are solutions that don't cost as much, or at least, you know, could be more cost effective and not create that trickle down effect of all the healthcare problems that come from throwing these unhealthy, fast, quick.
Yeah, we need to change our food system drastically, and I think the pandemic showed, because so many people were freaking out that they couldn't get these foods, but they're buying these processed foods that are coming in from all over the place, and we didn't have a problem because we bought directly from our local people, and we just made food out of that, you know, and it's not that hard just to make real food. And like, I prefer to eat plant-based mostly, especially when I'm home. And when I'm traveling, it's a little hard to do sometimes. And it's hard to say no, of course, when you're being presented food, so there's exceptions to it, but I prefer to eat plant-based. And, you know, and it's, even that's hard to deal with when you're out and about, because like if you're at a restaurant, and usually and you don't need to make plants try to taste like a hamburger. I mean, it's an option, but you could just like plants
Is that impossible to do? Oh, wink,
because
wink.
like,
Yeah.
because you know, at Owamni, like half the menu is plant-based because it's just easy to have lots of foods that just taste good. You don't have to like utilize all this over-processed food. Again, it's not the solution.
Right. Great question, Rebecca. And can I play off that and just ask, how is access to healthcare in, say, like the Pine Ridge Reservation? So not only do we like throw unhealthy solutions into populations that need healthy solutions, but then what's the access to healthcare or preventative health? You know, here we sit in this great preventative health company. What's accessibility?
Preventative health, not so much. There's not a lot of education or helping people with that, because you go to hospitals, you know, if you go to Pine Ridge, guarantee there's going to be soda machines right when you walk in the door, you know, for example. And but, you know, there's IHS, which is the Indian Health Services, and things like that that are out there, but they're not great systems because they're underfunded and they're oversaturated, and it's really hard to get any kind of quality health care out of that, and they usually just pump people with more drugs, which is why we have opioid situations and things like that. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but again, preventative health, because food is medicine, so we got people to eat healthier, but part of that's creating the access to the foods, and part of that is creating access to the education about it, you know, and that's a big part of what we're those are our two pillars again, which is just creating access to Indigenous foods and creating access to Indigenous education, because when I dug back through history, those were the two big pieces that the United States government used against us as Indigenous peoples to keep us down, was to, number one, remove us from our land spaces, remove us from our education system, which was countless generations of knowledge, and replace that with something. And, you know, so we needed to do something to give that back. We needed to find a way to reclaim that. So, because those two pieces are really powerful. And so that's what we're going to do to help make a change, hopefully.
Yeah, love that. It's a great answer. Yeah. I'm sorry, Lydia.
Hi, I'm Lydia.
Hi.
I'm actually Krista's niece. It's nice to meet you. I was just curious, as we've been like talking about all these like accolades and accomplishments that you've done, kind of the institutions where they've come from, I guess I just found myself curious about like what you, at the end of the day, find like most pride in, or what just like warms your heart the most about kind of all the things that we're talking about.
You know, for me, it's hard to look back on all these big accomplishments. It's really obviously, you know, it's hard to step back sometimes, you know, because this is like today's award or honor is huge. You know, it's a really big one, and I don't take it lightly. But it's sometimes I feel like I'm on the move so much because I feel like I have X amount of years to really put a lot of work and passion into this to make changes, and then eventually hopefully I have things set up to pass it on for other people to do the work. But I feel like I have enough energy to go for a while and to do this, but I just see a need. Like I feel like there's more work than I can accomplish in my lifetime, and I just want to do as much as I can, so that just keeps me moving. And I really enjoy being able to hold spaces to have these conversations, to talk about real things, and to get people to understand, you know. And, you know, so it's going to be really important to continue to do this work for a while. And hopefully one day I can just be sitting on a beach in Belize and have a little shack and have maybe a 2-person taco shop. I'll keep it simple.
I'd like to see how that goes for you. All of a sudden that area in Belize is going to be like a tourist destination. Yes. But no, so your passions are really about like using your time wisely and the time that you have here on Earth.
Yeah, absolutely.
To do what you can, but also set up a system that can continue your work.
Yep, and be role models, of course.
Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Mine isn't more of a question. My name is Nick, by the way. It's more of an expression of gratitude. So, as I've been a chef and I've collected many different cookbooks, there's one thing that's missing. One thing that, as I've heard you speak to multiple occasions, even in the cookbooks that I read about my indigenous cultures of Bohemia and Scandinavia, there's something that's missing that's inherently in your book and in what you're doing. So the expression of gratitude is that you're bringing spiritual alchemy, right? It's a culinary alchemy that you're bringing, and I think that's the real thing that's missing in food, because everything can be kind of kitschy, and it could be would be keto, carnivore, or whatever it is, and somebody will appropriate a different name for a restaurant. But what I think you're doing is actually healing and bringing knowledge to that space. So just wanted to say
Thank you. And thanks for making the food.
Those are beautiful sentiments. Thanks, Nick.
Hi, my name's Ben, and I agree with you that lawns are stupid. So,
There's a movement.
what should I start planting now, and how can I get access to those things to plant?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great resources out there. I've been on Seed Savers Exchange board for about 8 years. They have a great catalog of all sorts of stuff. They're a really great nonprofit that just has a lot of beautiful things, and they're not even very far away because they're just down the river in Decorah, not too far, in kind of north in the, what's that part of Iowa called? Driftless region.
Yeah.
And then so, but like I just started seeds. I think they're popping up pretty fast. So I mean, I just encourage people to grow whatever you can. There's plenty of stuff, and it's okay if you're not perfect at it.
Yeah.
You figure out some stuff that you like to grow, and you're better at it than others. And some years are just weird. Like some years something just doesn't work, it's just the way it is. But, it's just putting tons of plants around, and I just bought a house this last year, so it was a little too late when I closed. It was already deep into the season, but this year I'm not going to rip up the lawn, but I'm just going to put a bunch of planting boxes out there and just cover the front lawn with a bunch of food, because that's what it should be. It's a big empty space, so why not use it for that, and practice what you preach, I guess.
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
But yeah, grow things that make you happy, and there's lots of there's so many great resources out there. There's so many great garden stores around. There's so many great, there's heirloom seeds, and there's all sorts of fun stuff. But just start right now. Get some seeds in the soil right now, and it's so fun to start things from seed to on.
Yeah, you have a different appreciation for it.
Yeah.
So for those of us who don't have a green thumb, which is me, like what's one or two things that you would say, okay, it's almost like a guarantee that you'll go from seed to...
I mean, it's hard because there's soil and water and all the
Yeah.
things. So it really just, and sunlight, of
Sure.
course, and it just really depends. But again, some things grow really great. And I think I put one nasturtium plant down last year, and that thing took over everything.
Wow.
And it tastes so good. But there's just, there's a whole bunch of things you can be doing, and it's just, but I encourage people to dig around to some of those places like Seed Savers and look at their seed stocks and just order some fun things and see how it works. And there's plenty of online resources everywhere. There's countless YouTube videos. There's all sorts of things. So just, you have all the education at your fingertips and in your pocket probably. So just utilize it.
Make it your own food lab, really, right? Like
Exactly.
experiment. Yeah, it's a great question, Ben. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions?
And pollinators, though, grow lots of pollinators.
Any other questions? Yeah, okay.
Hi, my name is Andrea. So we were at the restaurant and we found out about Labrador tea. And I'm from Stillwater too. We were walking around Stillwater trying to find Labrador tea, but there wasn't any randomly in Stillwater. So we were wondering where you source your Labrador tea.
Well, in the beginning days, we were just harvesting a lot of ourselves, and I would go up around like Burnside, up around Ely and stuff like that, because there's just miles and miles of Labrador up north. It's a little too warm down here. I don't really see any Labrador down here very often. I think I've run into a couple of really small patches, but up north, when you're up there where it's a lot colder, and if you've ever been in the Boundary Waters, it's just everywhere. So. But again, there's a lot of other plants. So anyways, we use, luckily I found a small group in Duluth making teas out of the wild plants around them up there, and they're called Anawata Herbal. So we've just been working with them really closely since we opened up Owamni, because they're harvesting all these beautiful plants to make teas and all these beautiful tea mixtures using things like puffed wild rice and Labrador and rose hips and all these things, you know, and it's a flavor of where we happen to live. It's a flavor of Minnesota. So they're a great company, and we'll be selling some of their stuff at the market when it opens up in just a few weeks in Midtown Global.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no other questions. I have a couple more.
Yeah, go
but I'm
for
going
it.
to try. I'll keep them short.
Sure.
So what's one thing that all of us here listening to you could do to make an impact in supporting the work that you're doing? And the work, we didn't get a chance to talk about what you and Mecca are doing, but, you know,
Oh, yeah.
kind of flowing through all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of movement going on right now with Indigenous food sovereignty across the nation. I just got back from a huge conference in Vegas where there was probably 4,000 people from tribal nations everywhere. And there's a really big conference that happens in Shakopee. I think this year it's going to be in October, called Seeds of Native Health. And that'll be just bringing in people from all over the nation to really be coming in to do things that are focused on Indigenous food sovereignty. So there's a lot of work and effort going into it right now, and we've been working really closely with like Senator Tina Smith on the Farm Bill and trying to persuade them to get some specific wording changes into this next iteration of the Farm Bill to make it a little bit easier for us to do our work, because there's a lot of government rules that are still very kind of outdated and even racially motivated, you know, from older days that don't need to be there anymore. So we're trying to make some necessary changes, and hopefully we'll see that with this year's Farm Bill, which happens every 5 years. So that's a big deal. But I don't know, there's just a lot of change, again, that has to be out there, and we're just trying to do whatever we can to influence and help it happen. But there's a lot of cool projects going on. I just encourage people to keep their eyes open for any upcoming kind of Indigenous food sovereignty situations, or just support people of color in general. You know, I travel all over the place, and my partner Mecca, she's a food writer from Minnesota too, and she had primarily been focused on Black foodways because that's how she identifies, obviously. And but when we got together, we just kind of realize a lot of this work is the same work, and we should really just kind of come to a table together, and we should really be we can be a lot more powerful if we're all kind of in it and the same, you know. So we created a nonprofit entity called BIPOC Foodways Alliance, where it's just a place for Mecca to be able to do a lot of storytelling and to shine a lot of awareness on a lot of BIPOC food projects, and not necessarily from famous chefs that get all the attention like myself or like our friend Nia, who's on our board, Nia Vang, but to talk to families and talk to grandmothers who hold all these family stories and have all this stuff, you know. So she does a really great job of capturing that. But you know, whenever we travel, we're always on the look for cool BIPOC restaurants to see what's going on out there. And sometimes they're really hard to find, you know, because there's a lot of hurdles for people of color to get into these things, because, you know, you need $500,000 to open up a restaurant in today's world, and it's unattainable for a lot of people, and we need to figure out better systems to get more interesting and just healthier and more culturally appropriate foods out there. So I would just say be aware and just, you know, see privilege as it is and name it, understand histories, read this book, and, you know, just let's all eat healthier and just, you know, start to celebrate diversities instead of trying to homogenize everything.
Yeah, it's a beautiful answer. And the BIPOC Foodway Alliance, is that the handle if people want to start following that?
Yep, you can find BIPOC Foodways on Instagram and stuff like that. Okay. And there's BIPOCfoodways.org with some information. It's not as far-reaching as NATIFS with that, but it's also just really important storytelling. And we kind of modeled it after Southern Foodways Alliance that does such a great job of storytelling in the South. But we really wanted to do something that really brings people of color. So we've held lots of kind of dinner gatherings and just bringing in specific guests from different cultures and getting everybody to come together to tell stories. And it's just been a lot of fun to document those stories. And, you know, Mecca's finding ways to get them out there for people to see.
Keeping that ancestral wisdom around all of these beautiful practices around food and life and culture alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and well and thriving.
Absolutely.
And proliferating, hopefully, yeah. Okay, last question, I promised.
Absolutely.
If all of us are going to go to Owamni tonight, because we might. We can't.
Can't.
Okay, we can't. Okay. Well,
You can go there.
Next month we'll plan another outing. So, what would you recommend we order? And I know everything is wonderful, but what's your favorite?
They were just getting ready to do a menu change, so I'm guessing that when we reopen, we're just going to move right into the next menu phase.
Sure.
So there might be some things on there that are different, but I try to keep some things on there that are just staples and simple. So the sweet potato dish has just kind of been a staple because it's just so simple, and it's just roasted sweet potatoes, and we make this maple chili crisp that goes with it, and it's just so simple but so delicious.
Sounds delicious.
And it reminded me of just living in Mexico, where you'd see those guys wandering around with their little steam carts, and they sell the sweet potatoes, and then they put lime and chili and salt and everything, but those flavors just kind of reminded me of that. But just keeping some simple plant forward foods in a lot of it, and being able to offer true wild rice to people, so that if they haven't ever tried it, it's there for them, and using some heirloom varietals. Like we utilize a lot of tepary beans, which is a really cool bean from the Southwest that does grow wild in some of the crags and rocks and stuffs down there, but it's a drought resistant plant that we might become really valuable as we continue to abuse all of our water sources, and we're going to need more food production with things like tepary beans could be a really good choice for places,
Okay, so a lot of options, and a whole new menu coming soon.
Yep, it'll be a little bit lighter because we're just getting out of the cold winter months, so we're getting into more summer, and like ramps are probably starting to come up right now, and fresh gingers and all the things. So try to make it a little more spring to taste like the season, and we'll see we'll just have fun with it.
Yeah, which I think all of us here from Minnesota are more than ready for. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then in a few weeks we're holding a week of James Beard residency at this brand new food hall in Chelsea called Market 56, I think. Well, we're doing five nights of just storytelling through food there.
That sounds really interesting. Sorry, I kind of lost
No, it's
my
okay.
voice.
It's okay.
Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up.
Okay.
Because I lost my voice. So I probably better cut it short. But Sean, I just want to say thank you for being here. I mean, you are just an incredible human, and I think kind of just even sitting through an hour and a half conversation, you can see why he's been nominated one of the top 100 most influential people in the world this year. So keep up, the awesome work that you're doing, and just know that you have so many, I know you know this, but you have so many probably people that you know and don't know, like all of us, who are just cheering you on.
Well, thank you.
So in light of a really busy day, I just want to let you know how much we appreciate you sharing your time, wisdom, and expertise with us. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Appreciate
for having
you.
me.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
I want to say a special thank you to
with
everyone
that,
at Self
I just
Esteem
wanna know, you can
Brands,
still
the
feel free
parent
to
company of
enjoy this
Anytime
appetizer
Fitness,
as you walk
Waxing the City, Bar. I want to say a special thank you to everyone at Self Esteem Brands, the parent company of Anytime Fitness, Waxing the City, Bar Method, Stronger You Nutrition, and Base Camp Fitness. We are grateful for the recording space and support you have provided to our podcast platform and team. You are a true example of what it means to rebel and be well. You can learn more about Self Esteem Brands via the link shared in the show notes below. We appreciate and savor every sip of Dry Farm wines during our podcast conversations and every event at the Point Retreats. As a health and wellness platform, we are grateful to have a pure and unique wine that is free of sugar and additives, grown on small family farms, and brings a bright and soulful and vibrant glass of wine to share with the community we love. Cheers to our Dry Farm wine friends and family. You can learn more and order your own bottles of Dry Farm wine by clicking the link provided in the show notes below. That simple and serene moment when we glide across the lake at the Point Retreats on our Paddle North paddleboard is one of the most cherished moments. It's a gift when we and our guests blend into nature and lose track of time and space as we soar across the pristine Whitefish chain of lakes. Thank you, Paddle North, for being our preferred Minnesota-based brand and company. We honor every memorable paddle that brings great clarity and balance. Click on the link provided in the show notes below to see all the incredible lake gear available with Paddle North. The Point Retreats and Rentals is situated roughly 30 minutes outside Brainerd, Minnesota. The property's private peninsula boasts over 1,500 feet of stunning shoreline, spanning 3 lakes on the Whitefish chain of lakes. The Point property is owned by 2 purpose-driven leaders who share a strong desire to lead others to optimal health and well-being. Our team believes in proactive, modern-day health, shifting our mindsets to valuing quality of life in the same capacity as we value quantity of life. We aim for every experience at the Point to enhance and deepen your whole being health by providing many opportunities for well care during your stay. Whether you need time to renew, reset, or reconnect, we have a space that can host your family, group, or team. Click on the show notes below to find out more about the Point Retreats and the Point Rentals.
It's hard to feel okay when your entire body aches, and you know you need to change, but you think, what difference will that make?